I wanted to first start with an acknowledgement of country, and I wanted it to be local and relevant. So Darlinghurst and Woolloomooloo were once cheap places to rent, and as such always provided low-cost rental accommodation for a percentage of Aboriginal people. However, as busy roads went underground and Darlinghurst and Woolloomooloo gentrified, access to cheap rental slowly declined. The commodification of land has also had its impact on the way we live and view homes and homelessness. Strong local campaigns such as the Green Band saw public housing built in Woolloomooloo, and many displaced First Nations people relocated to the Loo. Wallumballa Park in Woolloomooloo is also known as a place where many First Nations people camp and make themselves a home for the night. I often reflect on the fact that sleeping under the stars in Woolloomooloo is something that their ancestors have done for time immemorial. So I think it's fitting that we are launching this research on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So welcome. I'll give a little intro to myself because I'm here. So I've had a lifelong commitment to delivering housing through the lens of social justice. Much of my work is informed by my childhood growing up in a boarding house in inner Sydney, Newtown. So my commitment to housing justice and land use planning is not just about rhetoric, it's about lived experience and informed values. And I'm excited by this research because it's so important to talk about what's going on in the housing space and the ability to actually deal with a supply-related issue in the rental market and how to actually bring some equity into that space. So very excited to be here. And to have worked with Macquarie Uni on delivering this amazing research and the Tenants Union. So I think we're going to go to Emma Greener, who's with the CEO of National Shelter, and she's going to do a little bit of a presentation that shows what's actually been going on using data from SGS about the housing market and what's actually been happening in New South Wales and particularly Metro Sydney before we get into the research. Okay. So, Emma.
Great. Thank you, Stacey. And my apologies that I can't be there with you in person today. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the land of the Yugambeh language people here on the Gold Coast and pay my respects to elders past and present, and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land that you're meeting on, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us today. So I'm just going to share my screen, which is a presentation, a brief presentation on the Rental Affordability Index. So my apologies for those who may have seen that. Now, can I just get can you see that? Can someone just let me know if you can see that? Great, thank you. So just a bit of a brief background around the index. So the index has been, this is our 9th year for the Rental Affordability Index between National Shelter and SGS Economics and Planning. So it was developed because all other affordability indexes related to home ownership and purchasing. So this was a specific index set up to look at what was happening around rental affordability over time. So the metric that we use is housing costs, that are exceeding 30% of a low income household's gross income. So being in housing stress, which is a metric that we would all be used to. And what the index does, it's a measure of total household income. So the measure of income that we use is total household income of renting households, and that varies by the region and capital city. And the measure of rents that we use is the median rental price of the dwelling based on the bonds that are lodged. So if you look at the colourful table next to you, it provides, I guess, a heat map, and we will see some maps shortly. But you know, if a household is paying 30% of their income on rent, you know, their index score is 100, they seem to be, you know, facing unaffordable rents. And then as the you know, the amount of money that they're spending on their rent changes, you know, the index number goes down, and they're looking at, you know, rents that are considered to be severely unaffordable or extremely unaffordable. The next image that I'm going to show you relates to metropolitan Sydney, and what it does, it will track over 4 years from 2020 to 2023 the changes for the average household in relation to rent. So this isn't low income households, this is average income households. And what you can see, so starting off with the considerable amount of green and dark green, that over that particular slide, how it shifts into, you know, the orange and dark orange, which demonstrates that for average income households over that 4 years, how much more unaffordable metropolitan Sydney is becoming. Now, I know this might be a little bit difficult for some to see in the room, but this just shows rental affordability more broadly for average income households from 2012 through to, you know, the last quarter, or through to Q2 2023. So that's for Greater Sydney. So we can really see that deterioration from 2020 down to 2023, so post-COVID. And then when it comes to, you know, regional New South Wales, you know, can also see that deterioration as well. So what we're experiencing in terms of rental affordability and the decline of affordability isn't just confined to the metropolitan area of New South Wales. And just quickly, I guess, you know, looking at the lived experience of some particular, you know, cohorts, and what this shows is that for a single person on benefit, so who is on job seeker, what this graph clearly shows is the impact of income. So the doubling of job seeker, you know, during COVID, and how much it contributed to enhancing affordability, you know, for that particular period. So, you know, we've always got to remember that the one side of affordability isn't just the dwellings, but it's also people's capacity to pay. And then if we look at the sort of 4-year period from 2020 to 23, we can see that for Sydney, there is nowhere that is affordable for people who are a single person on benefits. So severely unaffordable. People would obviously be paying, you know, 100% of their income on rent, you know, just to be able to live in Sydney. Just briefly, in terms of affordability for hospitality workers, we can see the change that has occurred for hospitality workers, and what is occurring for, you know, single pensioners, and how the Sydney metropolitan area is unaffordable for single pensioners as well. Just briefly, I'll just bring up some slides that show some selected sites across Sydney, but also in terms of regional New South Wales, to show how much, you know, what has been the decline of affordability, you know, across all of New South Wales. But in sort of Western Sydney, you know, we can see that in 2021 there was, for an average household, and this is what we have to remember, these are for average households, that, you know, it was relatively, you know, it was affordable. But the change that has occurred in 2023, we can really see that deterioration of affordability for an average household. So we can only begin to imagine what it is like for those households who are on much lower incomes. And when we look at, you know, sort of northern parts of New South Wales, and particularly along the sort of, you know, northeast and the coastal areas where, you know, we have, for example, Airbnbs, and we've been experiencing, considerable, climate disasters in terms of flooding and places like Lismore and northern New South Wales. We can see the deterioration of affordability in those locations as well. And then down in sort of Port Kembla, that area, over the 4 years from 2020 to 3, the deterioration of affordability for average income households. So just remembering that these are for average income households. And I think this is my final slide that also shows for Newcastle and Maitland that change from, rents being what would be considered to be acceptable and moderately unaffordable into, much more being unaffordable and severely unaffordable. There's just a final there. There is a really great dashboard. You can download the whole report itself, but you can also play and look at particular postcodes that might be in your area across Australia, and look at the graphs for various household types, but also, graphs as well that show the clear numbers of deteriorating affordability. And I'd highly, recommend that you have a look at that and, use that in your advocacy as well. So I'm going to leave that there. I hope that sort of really sets the scene to what's been happening, and using that as a jump off point for the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Emma. That's great. It's a great overview of why this research from Macquarie is so important. John, I'm going to get John to come up and introduce the panel and ask some questions.
Thanks very much, and really thanks to everyone online who's watching. I know there's a lot of people who've registered via the Zoom. I think what's important about this is that Emma's right, and the SGS Economics, which was information was produced a few weeks ago, Ellen Witt, who's the principal author of that, is good at saying that demonstrates the extent of the problem. That's how graphically, and she almost jokingly says we need to invent new darker colours to describe how bad it is in certain situations. The colours that we've got don't go deep enough to show graphically how difficult the situation is. So on that note, we, at the great invitation of Macquarie University, Dr. Alistair, Sisson and a number of others, including the Tenants Union, participated in a group piece of research that said if that's the extent of the problem, which we know, what are one of the things that we can do to address it? So hence the Regulating Rents, International Examples and Experience paper was fostered. The main thing I think that we're all we almost called this session the F word, is us being able to talk about the F word without mentioning the F word about rental freezes. What I think everyone absolutely agrees is there's such a huge area of rental reform that's needed. And this piece of research absolutely leans into that. So I'm going to get Dr. Alistair Sisson to talk first about some of the findings and talk to one or two of the slides, and then we'll go to a panel discussion of all four, including a couple of questions we've got and any questions from the floor. So Dr. Alistair Sisson, for those who don't know others know, is Macquarie University Research Fellow. He's interested in the dynamics of housing and economic policy and planning. He's got extensive experience in territorial stigma, so a way in which we can focus on estate redevelopment. And his research and studies have been in how, for example, the Waterloo estate in particular has been an area where some of those ideas are most contested. His subsequent research has spanned private rental sector affordability and security trends, the politics of economics and urban densification, and some other emerging trends in urban governance internationally.
So thanks, John, for the introduction, and Stacey as well, and also for collaborating on this project, which has been really interesting and enjoyable for both myself and Dr. Penelope Bowyer-Pont, who is my co-author on the report. I think the rationale for this report was really to engage with the complexity of rent regulation as an area of housing policy, and to respond to some of the oversimplified and occasionally bad faith debates about rent regulation that are taking place at the moment in Australia. What we wanted to do really was just illuminate the diversity of approaches that are taken in various rent regulation regimes around the world, and to communicate that generalizing how rent regulation works is really very difficult. because it's such a varied phenomenon. One of the things that we found is that it is very common and increasingly common in the OECD region. Over 20 OECD members have forms of rent regulation on the books, and multiple subnational jurisdictions, so municipalities, states and provinces at the lower level than the nation state. And interestingly, probably a dozen or so jurisdictions have introduced new rent regulation regimes or updated rent regulation regimes in the last 5 to 10 years. So it's a contemporary housing policy response, policy response to what is a global, but I guess geographically differentiated housing crisis. One of the other and fairly straightforward findings of the research is that rent regulation works to improve security of tenure for renters and to moderate rents over the long term. The extent to which it does those things obviously depends on the particularities of rent regulation, and things like how strict or how permissive the rent cap are, but also other things like how many dwellings in the private rental market it actually applies to. So the slide that you see on screen now is an attempt to summarize some of the diversity within rent regulation around the world. Hopefully it does a good job of that, but by the looks on some of your faces, maybe not. But basically, the rent cap is one important but not alone definitive component of rent regulation. So obviously it's important, the level of the rent cap, whether it's set at 2%, 4%, the equivalent of the change in consumer price index or some other kind of index. There are a multitude of different approaches that you can see outlined on the screen. But that also interacts with a couple of other important features, namely whether rent regulation involves vacancy control or decontrol. So that is whether rents are regulated from one tenancy to the next, or whether rents are set freely between a landlord and a tenant when a new tenancy begins. So that's the more common approach globally. Probably around 2/3 to 3/4 of the policies that we looked at involved only limiting rent increases within a tenancy and not prescribing them at the beginning of the tenancy. And that obviously means that the extent to which rent regulation has an effect, a downward pressure on rents is more limited. And I think it's more of a kind of security of tenure policy response. So making sure that people don't receive unaffordable rent increases within their tenancy first commenced first moved into a new rental property. Another important dimension that we want to stress is that there, in every case, are a range of provisions for exceptional rent increases. So it's not the case that a landlord can only increase rents by 2% no matter what changes in the property, no matter what circumstances the landlord faces. In every case, there are different provisions, some more prescriptive and some more permissive, that allow higher rent increases to deal with things such as capital expenditure on upgrades and renovations to a property. And that is to circumvent some of the historical issues around reduced maintenance activity undertaken by landlords with rent regulation in the middle of the 20th century. And then finally, just drawing your attention, I guess, to another aspect of this slide, is that in a number of jurisdictions, and particularly in the United States, rent regulation only applies to one component of the private rental sector. And usually that's because new dwellings or recently completed dwellings are excluded from rent regulation. So up to, say, for example, this famous example in San Francisco, every dwelling built after 1979 was excluded from rent regulation. So you had, in effect, a regulated private rental sector and an unregulated private rental sector. That was intended, and in most cases that is intended to prevent an impact on new construction. But it does also lead to some perverse outcomes whereby regulated rental dwellings are prematurely removed from the regulated private rental sector because there's an incentive to shift a property from regulated to unregulated. So a lot of the criticisms that have been directed towards rent regulation are in fact due to the exemptions to regulation rather than to regulation itself. That might be something that we speak a little bit more about as we go. But that was essentially, those were the findings of the report. We looked in detail at a few case studies, 5 to be precise. And we found that, rent regulations that are in place in Ireland and Scotland would have been very useful over the last 12 months. In Ireland, a 2% rent cap is in place in rent pressure zones. That would have saved a median Sydney renter over the last 12 months nearly $2,000. The 3% rent cap that's in place in Scotland would have saved the median Sydney renter about $1,700. Whereas regulations that are in place in jurisdictions like the ACT or in Oregon are much more permissive and would have allowed rent increases above the general level of rent inflation that we've seen in CPI figures over the last 12 months. So there's huge diversity. Some approaches more effective than others. And I think really what we need to consider is what's appropriate for New South Wales. What are the types of trade-offs that we're willing to accept rather than just dismissing rent regulation carte blanche.
Thank you. I'll get Gary and Stacey to join the panel. So if you can't otherwise, so I was remiss not, first of all, 2 things, acknowledging the member for Newtown that we have here, Jenny Leong. Thank you very much for coming, who I know is a passionate advocate for rental reform. And also, I think it's worth noting that the Rental Commission of New South Wales sent her apologies today. She was invited. She does have a copy of this report. It was made available to her last week. And in commentary around it on the day in the media, she talked about the way in which the Irish model, for example, that you just mentioned, that differentiates particular zones or circumstances. And I think her staff are here to represent her. Will correct me if I've got this wrong. The question that's always been is, under what circumstances would certain reforms in certain areas work best? And what's the way to make sure? Economists often argue that it's always perverse, it's always going to be counter. Actually, that's not true. This research points to saying overseas in certain circumstances. And as the graph that Emma rightly showed, certainly during COVID, which was an exceptional circumstance, there was a very strong argument for saying, let's not touch anything, let's just keep it still. Another word beginning with F you could use, but it was a freeze. I'll start with you, Leo. And for those of you who don't know, Leo is the CEO of the Tenants Union of New South Wales, again, a passionate advocate around rental reform. Leo, why do we need rent regulation?
Look, I mean, fundamentally, we need it because things are not going well and people are being harmed very seriously by our failure to have a well-functioning, sensible system of ensuring that people can meet one of their most basic needs of a stable, healthy home. So one of the important takeaways from this research and just from observing the world is that rent regulation does work and is a feature of many cities and many countries that are doing much better than us at providing homes for people. So when people come out with this kind of carte blanche, it's always bad. It doesn't line up with reality. And I think that it's quite attractive, but it doesn't line up with the reality. And so it kind of can ring false. Basically, we need rental regulation, and we need not just in terms of affordability, in terms of the pricing, but in a range of other areas. We need to approach the way that we rent our homes, the way that we make sure that people have homes in a new way, because it is an essential service. It is a basic need that people have, and our current system is not delivering that. And a large part of that is because there hasn't been the guidance and the leadership from government, from the regulators, about what is expected. And so we have this divergence, I think, between what people are looking for in their homes and what advocates are talking about and what the industry is expecting that their role is to deliver. We don't see this in other essential services. So when you look at energy, for instance, there is an acceptance from both the providers, the creators of energy, the retailers, as well as the consumers, that every home should have a working energy supply, and that should be safe to use. You shouldn't be getting electrocuted from being exposed to energy, and that the pricing is going to be regulated. We have price controls on energy where you can look at comparison sites, and they talk about they're competing essentially for how low they can get compared to the price control, because there's this very different approach. It's similar to, we're also used to taxi prices. The reason that we have taxi prices controlled so that you know at 2 a.m. when you're trying to get home that you're not going to get ripped off is because the consumer is unable to kind of compete, to negotiate with the provider in that circumstance. It's very similar in renting. You have a basic need, you need to meet it, and that makes you very vulnerable to unfair treatment in a market system. And so we put in place protections, and that's what we're missing here. It's not controversial in all these other industries. It is only controversial in renting because we haven't seen this leadership, we haven't seen guidance from the people designing the system. And so we really need it for everybody's benefit, including actually owners and property managers who are increasingly feeling under pressure and hard on because they have not been given the proper guidance around how to deliver an essential service to a community.
Thanks, Leo. Dr. Gary Cox is a well-known academic, previously from Sydney University as part of the Henry Helen Trust, has lived and worked overseas in these sorts of areas. One of the things that we often hear is that the commercial world does this all the time. It sets rents and sets around commercial rents, the content and the timing, or other areas like social housing is generally set at 30% of income. What's some experiences that you've got about overseas that say, why is it we should be looking to overseas? As per the research, what's something really that we can know?
I think the first thing that stands out is that the old style rent freezes are a thing of the past, and those rent freezes that you might see economists talking about and saying the world will end if we institute such things here, were a feature of the interwar years in the USA and Europe, but also the post-war period. And probably heard of rent control in New York City and places in Europe, but that's not what this is about now. I think we call the old style first generation rent control, and what we're dealing with now and what Alistair's report looks at is third generation. These are very flexible, tailor-made regulations, and particularly tailored to the conditions of the local housing market and the various dynamics involved. So it's all very different. And the other aspect which Alistair has talked about in his introductory remarks is that out of 38 OECD countries, 25 have some form of system of rent regulation in place. So it's basically becoming a universal system of assisting renters across the OECD, as Leo's talked about energy price caps and energy price controls. When I was thinking about the standard economist's response to this issue, I was reminded about a parallel universe, very different era. The UK instituted minimum wage legislation in 1998, and Australia did in 2009 under the Fair Work Act. If you cast your mind back, and they're both a long time ago, the economists said the world will end if we have minimum wage legislation. There won't be the supply of low-skilled jobs will dry up as employers won't be able to afford the minimum wage. In both countries, here and in the UK, minimum wage legislation has bipartisan support. Indeed, the UK Conservative government have just put it up last month. And there's not this barrage of economic rationalist talk, which is based on sort of first-year economics that some of us all did about old-style first-generation rent control. So it's a good regulatory policy to have in the toolbox. And just to quote Minister Rose Jackson from The Guardian on Sunday, she said, the government's determined to do everything we can to put every part of the housing system under the microscope. And this is such a recommendation we'd like to put to her and to the Minister for Fair Trading.
Thanks, Gary. We've got Stacey with us, and Stacey, I know that for those of you who don't know, Stacey Meyer's long advocate around issues of not just rental, but rent as it relates to income. So one of the things that we hear around research such as this is that once vacancy rates fall well below the 3% down to under 1%, income becomes an issue. Just give us some thoughts about how income and rent are inextricably linked. And up until now, we've been able to separate them, but now we do that to our peril.
Yeah, so a lot of the work I do is around housing affordability, particularly at a local government level. And probably one of the oldest councils to have a really an affordable housing regime is Willoughby, and it's because Willoughby became inexpensive a long time ago. And so they implemented an affordable housing program. I mean, they haven't delivered a lot of stock, unlike Sydney City who have. But what you see is that the driver of that for local government is actually the fact that they don't have any workers, they don't have any cleaners for their shopping centres, they don't have any staff for their aged care facilities, they can't get childcare staff. So what you see is that local government trying desperately to respond to really what is a statewide program and problem failure. And one of the things about the research is it shows that if you do nothing, it's not going to go away. It is absolutely going to get worse. And the Irish model shows that. So I think it's really important to actually acknowledge that we need to do something, and we need to do it pretty soon. Otherwise, the problem's not going to go away.
Thank you. I might go back to you again, Alistair, just about the zones. Just explain a bit more as per the recommendations about how one of the zones or two of the zones might work in particular circumstances.
Sure. So we've been talking a little bit about Ireland, where there is a system in place of rent pressure zones. So these are based on electoral boundaries, and rent regulation comes into place in Ireland when a rent pressure zone has experienced quarterly rent inflation above 7% in at least 4 out of the last 6 quarters. So it comes into effect when housing costs are rising rapidly over a sustained period of time. That at the moment applies to probably about 2/3 of the country and all of Dublin and other large cities in the country. And, you know, looks set to remain so. Those controls remain in place for 3 years and then they're reassessed. I think it's interesting, you know, we don't really have the data available to us to examine what regions might be rent pressure zones in New South Wales. And that's one of the recommendations of the report that I'd like to stress is actually, in order to understand how well our private rental sector is performing, we need much better data. We need to collect information on rent increases throughout the tenancy in the same way that we collect information on rents at the beginning of a tenancy. That would allow us to do something like a rent pressure zone regime, but it would also allow us just to track how other policies are affecting the private rental sector, or how the lack of intervention in the private rental sector is leading to certain outcomes. So Ireland is one model. There are others in place. New York City, for example, you know, it's quite a complicated story because there are different forms of rent regulation in place, but it comes into effect when vacancy rates reach below 5%. So it's a response in recognition of the fact that the housing system is performing badly. And that, I think, is fairly uncontestable that that's the case in New South Wales at the moment.
Gary, just a supplementary on that from you then.
Yeah, I just thought I'd like to give you all a number to remember, and that's the number 8.5%. If you have an 8.5% rental increase, that means you're paying an extra month's rent a year. Just think about that to a struggling family. So there's lots of stats in the report, but just have that number in your mind and just think what happens to a family. Are they going to cancel Christmas that year? It's going to have a real effect. So 8.5% is you're paying month 13 rent. And if it happens the next year, you would be paying month 14. So I think that's an important thing to remember.
I think the other issue that the research shows is that there's things you can do even before you get to rent regulation. You need no cause eviction, because otherwise, whatever system you put in place, it will start to backfire on you. So you need that in place, and you need the data. That's the one thing that it points really strongly towards. And both of those can be done even before you do rent regulation.
I'll just follow up on the data point because it's a very important one, and it's not completely front and centre of the report. We had a discussion in the working group a few months ago, didn't we, Leah, about the importance of lodging, of real estate agents and landlords lodging every increase of rent. Now, why is this important? I've been a renter for most of my adult life in all sorts of sectors: social housing, housing associations, cooperative housing, and private rental, both here and in the UK. And it's only recently that there's an expectation that rents will go up every year. And that's a most important thing for the policymakers to understand. We're living in quite a different space in terms of the rental housing market. There's now an expectation that the landlord will put the rents up every single year. So I think the data that the very simple lodgement of a form to fair trading of a rental increase when the agent sends out the notice to the tenants. So that should be an automatic thing so that we can know what proportion of tenancies are receiving rent increases every year.
Thank you. I'll now, and Stacey mentioned this, you cannot have this discussion. It's inextricably linked with no grounds eviction, no cause eviction. So Leo, I might get you to give us a bit of an update. I think most of us in the room would think we've somewhat stalled a little bit on what was meant to be a great area of change around that by this Christmas. So give us a bit of what your thoughts are around where we're up to with all of that.
Yeah, well, and just to say quickly that, you know, both the rent increase or rent regulation setting prices at the beginning as well, and the no grounds eviction are part of a broader piece of trying to create a more stable renting system. Again, it goes back to that expectation. Renters need that stability. We know, for instance, that currently renting is causing people to physically age faster, but also the mental health outcomes between renters and owner-occupiers equivalizes when you get to about 5 to 6 years in your home, because you need this grounding to actually enjoy the benefits of a secure home. So both of these items are trying to get at a more stable. Now, stable investment is also an expectation that is currently not on the investor side. It's treated more like almost crypto, that you're looking to maximize this return quite quickly. People are fooled into thinking that because you've got a 30-year home loan, it's a long-term investment. But we know that most people don't hold their properties for anything like that length of time. And it is about leveraging capital gains, the tax settings, and improvements made to your community by other people to maximize this investment and flog it off. That's a thing that we want to change. That stability rent setting is all a part of that, setting these expectations. So when the new government came in, we had bipartisan, in fact, support for some reform around no grounds evictions. The Greens have adopted ending no grounds many years ago, 8 years ago, I think now. Labor had taken it to 2 elections in a row. And just before the state election, the Liberal National Party came out to support ending no grounds, but only at the end of fixed terms. Now, we've seen in Victoria, in Queensland, that ending no grounds only during periodic agreements, which Tasmania did in 1997, doesn't work. It actually produces some of these unintended consequences for those people on fixed terms that we actually want to avoid. And in Queensland in particular, we've seen an absolute disaster. So we need to make sure that we actually do end no grounds for everybody, for the whole market, and not just part of it. And that's the kind of thing that we wanted government to move on quickly, but get right. And so what we didn't want was a knee-jerk copying of Queensland, copying of Victoria, and getting it wrong. We wanted them to take the time, make sure that they understood the problems. That said, we still wanted to see this reform quickly. We thought it was certainly possible to have the no grounds implemented by 1st January in 2 weeks' time. And that clearly hasn't happened. We haven't even seen the bill yet to end no grounds. We have seen consultation on it, and we understand that government is considering their position. We know that people are receiving no grounds evictions once in every 18 minutes on average. It's a huge number of people who are affected by this system of denying people knowledge about why their home is being taken from them. And that causes all sorts of issues. The model of reform around no grounds isn't saying all of those evictions would end. It's bringing in transparency and evidence about why you should have this. And that means that all of these no grounds notices that are being served without transparency, without evidence, without scrutiny, degrades trust in the whole system, because you don't know, is it because the landlord's moving back in and they're going to use it as their home? Is it because they don't want to do the repairs that I just asked for? Is it because they're actually trying to avoid a rent increase case that I've just put in? And we saw very recently this case that really encapsulates this of Chrissy. She was in the papers, you might have seen her. She received a rent increase notice. She went and then she received another one. The second one was unlawful. She didn't know that. It went into the papers on Sunday. On Monday, she received a no grounds notice. And the landlords say that that's because of family circumstances, because they needed the house back. But the question then comes up with, why did you serve the rent increase notice? That those two things don't quite line up. But regardless of what the real reason is, Chrissy can't know. Chrissy doesn't know why she's been given this notice, and there's no obligation to tell her. And it means that the whole relationship between that tenant and that landlord is degraded. So bringing in this transparency, bringing a little bit of accountability goes a long way to producing a much better relationship, a much better outcome. But it also means that some pretty dodgy behaviour is cut off more at the source.
Any other comments on that? I might then talk about the ACT. So we in Australia sort of nominally put all of the various states and territories in a bit of a line, and we say ACT nominally has the best, and I think Northern Territory, they made some changes last week, but generally are the worst. Would that be true? Any comments on what's good at the moment and whether it's good enough?
I can talk a little bit about the ACT model of rent regulation. And I realise I misspoke a moment ago when talking about Ireland and said quarterly rent inflation. I meant to say annual rent inflation. To your question, the ACT model is very peculiar in the international context. So it is the only state or territory with rent regulation in Australia. The mechanism that they use is that rents can increase no more than 110% of rent inflation in Canberra over the last 12 months. So in essence, rents can be increased over and above the general level of rent inflation in the last 12 months. That seems relatively effective at preventing very excessive rent increases. Although as rent inflation grows, its ability to prevent those excessive rent increases diminishes. But it follows a kind of funny logic, in my reading at least, whereby rising rents justify rising rents. It's not a case that landlords' operating costs are increasing, or even the landlord's cost of living is increasing, but simply the fact that rents are growing throughout the private rental sector, and so the landlord should be able to increase rents over and above the rate at which rents have generally grown in Canberra's private rental sector. This doesn't really seem to me to be a regime with a strong rationale, and it's not replicated anywhere else around the world that we looked at. It is very common to link rent caps to inflation, all item CPI, or sometimes CPI excluding housing costs. There are a few other kind of wrinkles within that story as well. But focusing purely on a level of rent inflation for a rent cap seems to me fairly misguided.
I think you're exactly right, Alistair. You potentially, for a much bigger housing market like the Sydney region, you're setting up a vicious cycle of actually rents going up and up and up, because your rent increases feed back into the rent index and it just spirals upwards. So whereas I think we view that it does work reasonably well in Canberra ACT, it would not work well using that particular index here. And there are other CPI type indexes that can be
and just
used.
on that, there's another point to make about the relationship between rents and inflation more broadly. Rents have been part of the services component of inflation that has been driving general inflation over the last 6 months in particular. And if we allow rents to continue increasing unregulated, then that cycle of rents driving inflation driving rents in a tight rental market, that only continues. So what we've seen internationally, and probably half a dozen cases that I can think of, places that previously had a rent cap that was linked to CPI, realizing inflation is getting out of control, we need to reform this regime to put a hard ceiling on our rent cap, so that when inflation is high, people aren't getting rent increases of 12, 13, 14% just because inflation is growing. And as I said, it perpetuates a vicious cycle.
I think that was the strength of the research, really, that, you know, well, all of us, we've only got one model, which is the ACT model, and everybody talks about it as a model that might be able to be used. The strength of the research was that it showed that it wouldn't actually work very effectively in New South Wales or in the Sydney metropolitan area. So I think that's actually one of the real strengths of the research as well.
Leah.
It was just worth noting that, you know, the rent increases were often in the media tied to interest rate rises, but actually when you look at the Reserve Bank's data, comparing the rate hikes and the actual increases, the inflection point, time when the rent increases really started launching was a full year before any of the interest rate rises started. So there was absolutely something else happening there that led to this rent rise. It's not related to the interest rates, and the interest is the only big cost that you could potentially argue increases landlords' costs so much that they might have to increase the rent as a whole. In general, the rent collected is much more than the operating costs of delivering the service. So those two things are unrelated. Just going back to John's question about, you know, rating the states, I think the other thing about the ACT is they've only had no grounds ended since 1st of April 2023. So before then, we have actually no idea if it was going to be useful or not. And we're certainly talking to renters in Canberra. There were many people who never got to experience, or never got to challenge the rent increase, even though the law said they could, because there was no point. They would have their tenancy ended, and they knew it. And so we actually don't know what ACT would look like over time. ACT and South Australia are the only two states now who've passed legislation ending no grounds for both fixed term and periodic. And so just because everything else is completely undermined, they are now easily the top two, and everybody else is muddling about. The Northern Territory, it is worth saying, is consistently left behind, and needs to lift its game. But we've also seen, even from the national cabinet processes, where states and territories came together and made this agreement around 9, you know, relatively limited, relatively modest reforms, WA almost immediately came out and said they were going to ignore that national cabinet process. They weren't going to reform no grounds. And that was incredibly disappointing, because it means they're not taking any of the other reforms seriously. All of the research, and this goes back 50 years, shows that if you don't reform no grounds, all of your other reforms that you might want to do are undermined and won't be effective.
So as a truism, we're getting some calls that have come in online. Thank you very much for people who've sent the messages in. I'll pull a couple of them together. So one of them is just around, I'm reminded of what Alan Kohler said in his quarterly essay, that it's not just about tax or about supply, but both. We're in a world where we are seeing a net reduction in social housing. We can even ignore affordable housing. It's negligible amount of affordable housing, we often argue. So we're not having much social housing. We can't keep up, not even pro rata. And we're seeing less and less people accessing home ownership. How does that factor into the general discussion about the rental sector growing as a percentage of the tenure that people experience and consume their housing in? Any comments on that about supply, tax, how they interact?
Just one thing, because it might get lost in the discussion. One of the key findings that Alistair revealed was, with all these regulations in the wider pool of regulations, there was no documented effect on new construction. So that myth that you hear often on television debates, that somehow rent regulation will affect supply of housing, that is a myth. So that was a very important finding, Alistair.
Good.
So there's a few things to say. One is, we do need to think of the whole housing system as working together. And one of the big things that people often miss is that we have put ownership and owner occupation on this pedestal and said, that's the tenure you should aim for. That's the tenure you should kind of build your whole life around achieving. And we've set up tax systems to encourage that. We've set up planning. We've set up all sorts of cultural norms to support this. What that means is that we've diminished and lessened renting. We've kept it as a lesser form by design. It's in the legislation. It's in the way people talk about it. What that has meant, though, that owner occupiers, people looking to buy a place, are paying a premium because what they're being pushed towards is this particular product because the next best alternative is just simply not attractive. And so when you ask people about their aspirations around housing and people say we want ownership, we want to buy a place, what they mean is they want stability and they want affordability, particularly in retirement. They don't actually want the ownership itself. That's not the point. And when you dig into those kind of reasons, as Huri has occasionally, the big number one is always the security, it's the stability. So we've got to look at these systems and say, actually, we can make ownership more attainable for the people who really want to own by making renting better, by making renting more stable, more affordable, more long-term. And I think that the other thing to say is, when you look at all these cities around the world, they've got a choice, all the countries, they've got a choice around, do they engage in the market themselves by providing competition, by giving people really an alternative option to either the private renting or ownership, or do they regulate? And the best way of doing that is to do both a bit, rather than go all the way one way or all the way the other, mostly because going all the way into construction is incredibly expensive. That's really the only barrier. But it's a balance between regulation and sort of participation, giving people options. In Australia, we've increasingly decided to do neither. And that's why we continue to get into a worse and worse position.
One of the things that we hear sometimes it's meant to be the great saviour. And I think I was at something last week in Canberra where the Federal Minister made recommendations, or sorry, some announcements about concessions around the depreciation rate for build to rent. So I'm interested in comments about build to rent, given that we have a unsophisticated amateur, we often use the pejorative mum and dad investor running a lot of the rental housing. What's your views on build to rent in terms of what would otherwise be needed? And the reason why I say that, and I think I've learnt this from Leon, the Tenants Union, it doesn't necessarily at this stage yield longer or more secure leases. People are still moving as frequently. So we'll start with Alistair, then I'll come to you, Gary, and then Leah.
Yeah, well, I'll jump to Gary quickly because he's probably more of an expert on this than I am. But we should be careful not to confuse build to rent with an affordable housing option, which it's not. At the moment in Australia, it's predominantly new stock, trades at a premium. So that is to say that it's more expensive than most of the housing in the private rental market. Subject to the same tenancy legislation, which allows evictions without grounds, subject to unlimited rent increases. So there's not really any good reason to think that it's a superior option than what we think of as conventional private rental housing. That said, there are a few options if the build to rent sector grows for incorporating social housing within those schemes, because they don't have to deal with strata legislation. They don't have to deal with bodies corporate. And I know that is a big barrier to mixed tenure development on the building scale. But that is contingent on those subsidies existing, which, as we've talked about, don't seem to be forthcoming in any meaningful way. So I think while we shouldn't be opposed to build to rent, I don't think we should really think of it as really an affordability solution at all. It might mean that private rental stock is held for longer. I know research by Chris Martin and colleagues found that something between a quarter and a third of private rental properties are sold every 5 years. Build to rent developers would presumably be holding them on for longer. But that also has not been the case in some places overseas where build to rent is being traded just as frequently as small hold private rental properties.
Gary, then Leah on build to rent.
Yeah, I suppose I've had direct involvement in build to rent in the UK, the most celebrated scheme being the London 2012 Olympic Village. So there's now around, if I can think of the number, around 3,000 dwellings there. And this is the important point of difference. The UK planning legislation for London says that 50% have to be affordable housing. So it's jointly managed by Triathlon Homes, a community housing provider, and by a management company working on behalf of the Qatari investment bank that has been holding the Olympic Village since 2012. They will go on holding it for 30 or 40 years. So the product in the UK is subject to planning policy around affordable housing, and it's usually called affordable build to rent. The product here is a premium product like you might get in Manhattan, okay, and that has a 20% rental premium, but it doesn't need to be like that. Build to rent has gone, you know, the number of build to rent properties have gone up a lot in the UK, mainly around well-located railway stations is exactly where the developers like building them. They're usually held by pension funds, often American and Canadian pension funds. One thing it's done though is quite interesting. It's changed the way that tenants are viewed, because build-to-rent schemes in the UK view tenants as customers, not as the enemy. And I know that about the Olympic Village one, they have built in to their rental agreements that the rent won't go up any more than inflation. They want people to stay long-term. It's true that people tend to stay for 12 months or 2 years, but there's no reason for that except people's lives change. And there's generally two cohorts, younger professionals and people in the early years of retirement. They're two cohorts. They don't waste money on lots of useless gyms or services that people don't use. They run a very tight ship. And one of the things generally they do is if you qualify, they do some tests, you generally don't pay a bond when you move in.
Yeah.
But the fundamental thing is they treat, and they tend to employ people in the management companies from the hospitality industry who generally are nice to people. So they've actually, as a demonstration project about how the customer should be treated, it's a very powerful demonstration.
Thank you. Leo, and then I'll open the last few minutes we've got this to some questions from the floor.
So just quickly that, yeah, I think the proof is somewhat in the pudding still. The main claim, the big one that you can kind of hang some positives on in Sydney, in New South Wales, is that they'll hold the properties for longer. We haven't had build to rent for long enough to know if that will pan out. And we saw permissions given in the planning reform that only require them to hold it for 15 years before they stratify and can flog it off. So that's not long enough, frankly, to give a long-term tenure. We've seen some worrying signs where, yeah, people are put onto 12-month agreements and they're held in, and the rents are not anything like affordable. So I don't think there's a good case yet to give too much to the build-to-rent industry, because they have not demonstrated any commitment to a different model. It is all marketing at this point. I think that it is worth saying that we've had, you know, public housing, and particularly the Housing Commission, is really the big build-to-rent player in Australia and in New South Wales. They hold properties for a very long time. That's the kind of standard that if you're going to give away planning approvals, if you're going to give away a whole lot of things, that's the kind of level that you should be looking for, is that sort of commitment. We just haven't seen it. So the other thing to just finish on is that we've seen in institutional investment more broadly in bigger companies. So in New York, larger companies, that the bigger the holdings they have, the more frequently they evict people, the more frequently they increase rents. And there's a lot of resistance to this. In the US, there's often more kind of friendly views of the mom and pop landlords, as they get called, because they're not seen as so vociferous. They're not seen as just taking advantage to the same extent. For me, what that speaks to, and which is quite different here, what that speaks to is the mindset. The reason that they're engaged in the industry is what we need to change. It's not the size or the structure. It's actually, why do people think they're involved, and therefore what are they going to accept as reasonable behaviour within the sector?
I think the other thing is that the build to rent sector here is not institutional superannuation fund investors. It's Mirvac and Meriton. You only have to go get out of the train at Mascot, and nearly every single residential 15-story building there is build to rent, Mirvac, Meriton. So the people running and delivering is actually, it's the big developers anyway, who had just gone, okay, we're going to take that little bit of the market. So, you know, if it was like big superannuation funds that were doing it, then we might actually end up with a product similar to what's going on in the UK. But that's not what's happening here.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor now, Alistair? Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Just tell us who you are.
Hello. Yeah, Blake Richards. Yeah, just going on from the comments, what's driving, I think, the rental market is the price of property and the return on investment that's required. So the low interest rates actually have allowed people to make some very good and quick capital gains. And those capital gains aren't being taxed, or they're only being taxed at 50%. What's also driving up the market to some extent is the foreign investment. But what's really, I think, affecting the property market is Airbnb and the number of permanent rentals that are being taken off the market. And you might try and cap the permanent rental market, but what are your thoughts about trying to cap the Airbnb rental market? I don't think you can do it. So I think there are a number of strategies that the government could implement and basically to try and sort of reduce the demand and hopefully therefore increase the supply of properties available for permanent rental.
Thank you very much for that question. And you're absolutely right. There's a significant piece of work that I know we've been involved with around regulation of short-term whole house rentals. I'm happy to take Leo or someone to talk about, you're absolutely right, that the way in which the insidious nature of those in particular areas and markets has really been underestimated.
Yeah, just very quickly that, yeah, it absolutely has a big impact. It does, the impact does change in different places and we should be capping the number of nights that a place should go up, whether that's through a straight line or whether it's through sort of indirect means. It doesn't really ultimately matter. You want to reduce the viability of changing from a residential to a commercial setting without any oversight and without any consideration of how it's going to affect the local community. We do have to be a little bit cautious sometimes. There are huge numbers of places that have ever been listed on Airbnb, and sometimes people like to publish that number and suggest that that's going to be what comes back, and that's very unlikely. So there's a cohort of people who list it, say, an entire premises, but it's only when they're not there, and they're not likely to come back. There's also places that are like, I mean, I think it's reduced a little bit, but there were tree houses in people's backyards. That's not an appropriate residential home. So, you know, that there's a limit to the number. We should just be a little bit cautious about the scale, but it's certainly, even if it's only a quarter of them, say, that's going to make a significant impact. What I think it's not going to do is completely resolve the available stock needs of what we need. It might get us from, you know, 1% vacancy to 2% or 3%. It'll ease things, but we actually need to sustain quite high levels of, if we're going to use market dynamics to kind of do this, we need quite high levels of stock available just to kind of permanently almost to bring that pressure down. And I don't think the short-term holiday lettings by itself is going to get there, but it would certainly be a part of it.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Just and say who you are for people online.
More of a comment. I'm Penelope. I helped Alistair with the report from Macquarie Uni. Just to add, I was a bit late. Not sure if you mentioned it, but
yeah,
Penelope's the other research.
No problem. Hi. Something that really stood out for me in doing the background research was the problem with exemptions. So in all of the most of the international examples that we looked at, you know, the rent caps, landlords are able to apply for exemptions, but in many of the cases, and I'm thinking particularly about Minneapolis, you know, the exemptions were so easy for landlords to apply for and get that the rent regulations just became, you know, pointless. So I think just to say, you know, any system that we can work towards to stabilize rent would need to have more closer monitoring of the use of those exemptions.
I'm really excited about the fact that Gary's written the word exemptions and underlined it 3 times in red here. I can see that. So,
yeah, I totally agree with you. When I read the report first, I wrote against the Minneapolis St. Paul case study, how not to do it. And when I read it the second time, the penny dropped. The regulators there are obviously lobbied by industry incessantly because the exemptions are pretty insane. You know, a new property comes onto the market and you're out of the system in 15 years. I think the quality of a good regulation, which I'd recommend to the New South Wales government, is to keep it very simple, keep the objectives of the regulation very clear. Don't try and have competing goals for your regulation because that's a recipe for disaster, and really limit the number of exemptions. If you're going to think about exemptions for hardship, etc., look at it as a way that the landlord or owner needs to make a case to the tribunal about it. I think it should be there should be some compliance burden on the landlord or owner to demonstrate that an exemption for them in particular as an individual is justified.
Thank you.
Just very briefly, I gave a shout out to Penelope before she arrived, but I just wanted to say thank you.
I guess so,
very
yeah.
much
We'll
making
get
this
you to come up
report
here. Thanks.
possible. Did a huge amount of work, and also I hope you don't mind me saying had to face being evicted from her previous rental home during the course of this research project, which made it a very live experience.
Wow.
So yeah, we've been talking a lot about my report, but it's very much a collaborative effort.
We're just about to finish, so I'm going to end with, if there's no other questions from the floor, and again, yep, Gary?
Just a quick one. There's a lot of Crown land that's been heading back to First Nations peoples, but unfortunately the councils aren't changing the zoning to allow them to construct social housing on all of this available land. So massive increase in potential supply, but still limited. Do you know what steps the government are taking to at state level to maybe overrule the local councils to free up that land?
I'll let Stacey answer that. She's our sort of expert when it comes to Crown
I'm
land.
hoping this just turns on when I speak to it. I actually work with Alistair sometimes in Sydney Uni, and we run a course on how to support town planners to actually understand the importance for Aboriginal land councils in being able to develop their land. So that's happening with planners who are coming through the system. And the state government has actually introduced a SEP. It's called the Aboriginal Land SEP. And that allows Aboriginal land councils as a pathway to bypass local government. And there's also Roads to Home, which is one of the problems for a lot of the old sites is they don't have infrastructure. So there's actually a number of platforms to support them in that process.
I think that might be it, but I was just going to end with one final elevator pitch style response. And I've got to say thanks to Jemima from the Tenants Union who's given us this great idea. If you were Premier for one day, and there's a few people in the room I'm sure would like to be, in an elevator pitch way, what's the one thing that you would do to make a difference based on this work that you've done in this report? Alistair.
Okay, I'll start with the first thing that they should do, which is end no grounds evictions for both fixed term and continuing. It's an obvious thing that should have happened already.
Leo, one thing you would do if you're Premier.
I don't want to be Premier. I think that what we need to do is take this research, make a system that does a couple of things. One is make it stable and give people the option to stay where they are or move if they want to. And that's a big flaw in many systems. It's a big flaw in our current system. People don't get to choose to stay when they want to stay, and they don't get to choose to move when they want to move. That to me is how you make this renting regulation work, but our general renting system as well is the big missing.
Thank you. Stacey.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a weird irony in the system, and I don't know how you unpack it, but what they did with schools infrastructure was they actually make people go to the local school because people were choosing the better off schools. One of the problems with that now is people move, and then it's actually having all this impact on schools, and it hasn't changed it. It's still a problem with the schools that are considered undesirable still have low numbers, and the schools that are considered desirable. So there's something about, rent and a lack of flexibility and how it impacts on kids and schooling and the whole infrastructure system. And secondly, there's lunch for everyone. So just
Thank
make
you.
sure you grab something to eat.
Thank you. Gary?
If I was Premier for a day, I'd probably look at implementing the some part of the Irish system about rental pressure zones. Because I think in New South Wales, my perception is if you start something on a sort of sub-regional basis, gain it currency and acceptability, you can roll it out more widely. And also as a mental health issue, I'd get rid of this ridiculous thing about not having pets in people's properties.
We didn't go there. I'm just going to finish. Penny, would you mind just coming up and just sitting at the seat that you otherwise meant to take? I'm sorry. You get the last word. There you go. Premier for the day. Premier Penny, what would you do?
Just to agree, ending no grounds evictions and implementing something like the Irish.
Excellent. Fantastic. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I commend the report to you. Thank you to everybody online. This is the report. There's a link to it on our website. Thanks to Alistair, Leo, Stacey, Gary, and of course, Penny. Lunch is most welcome for anyone who's still here with us, but thanks very much. Could you please join me in thanking our panel? We'll just stay there. We'll get some photos, I think.